Hello students, welcome to the Analyst, dated 21st of August 2023. We look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. The first one will be regarding hate speech. Then we'll look at frictionless credit from RBI. Then we'll take up a case study on Shimla. Then we'll look at inflationary pressures, and this pertains to your onion prices. Then finally we'll look at the pardoning powers, in particular Reprieve. Now the first article pertains to your GS2. Now let's look at the context. So the police has cancelled events based upon hate speech. Now this begs the question that what is free speech? So we all know that free speech is protected under Article 19, which comes under your Part 3. Now we know one thing about the Indian Constitution, that it does not support absolutism. That means if there are rights, then there are reasonable limitations or restrictions, right? And we must appreciate that whenever we are talking about speech, the restrictions come under Article 19(2). And Article 19(2) to Article 19(6), it gives the power to the state to bring in reasonable restrictions. That means it helps the government to bring in laws which can reasonably restrict your free speech. Now, hate speech is one of such restrictions. Now let's understand what is hate speech. So prima facie, you should know that it has not been categorically defined. And whenever any word is not defined in a law, then what happens? We usually refer to the higher courts. The higher courts, that simply means the Supreme Court and High Court. And they will give some interpretation. So over the period of time, what we have understand about hate speech. So A, it is a form of expression, verbal, oral or otherwise. Then it advocates, incites or promotes some form of hatred to an individual or to a group of individuals. That means hate can be towards the community, towards the society at large. And what can be the impact of such a hate speech? So it can lead to violence, or to say so, it can also lead to a hate crime. And whenever we are talking about hate speech, it is antithetical to the principles of liberty. Why do we need liberty? For a holistic life or wholesome life. That is the wisdom that comes from Menka Gandhi case, right? And whenever we talked about Sakal Press versus Union of India, Indian Express versus Union of India, Bennett Coleman versus Union of India, all the cases which were pertaining to your free speech, simultaneously reasonable restrictions were read into. That means we need liberty, but we cannot abuse our liberties under Part 3. So any form of advocation, incitement of violence, promotion of hatred towards an individual, towards a person or a group of person for any number of reasons will be termed as hate speech. And what it does, what is the impact? So it can lead to marginalization. Let's say marginalization of a caste group, region group. So let's say I belong from a region in India. And if hate speech is not curbed, then what can happen? Then my community can be marginalized, my regional community, my identities. So I'll be scared about my identities, and that should not happen. Then Prima facie of having a state, of having law, is to have order, is to have peace. And whenever there is hate speech, it can turn into some form of violence or hate crime. And so, whenever peace and tranquility of a state is affected, who is most affected? It is the citizen. And whenever there is less peace, wherever there is conflict, then what happens? Tend to affect your livelihood. So, can we say that the moment there is hate speech, it is A, going beyond free speech, B, it is violation of any reasonable restriction, and thirdly, whenever I am violating all of this, I am somehow affecting the peace and tranquility, the law and order, and if I do so, will the economy be affected? If the economy is affected, then will the livelihood of ordinary citizens will be affected? So we have seen in our discussions of fundamental rights that my rights end when I impinge on or infringe upon your rights, right? Then we cannot let oppression sustain in the society. We cannot promote discrimination. Now, categorically mentioned in Article 14, 15, 16, 17, what do we see? The wisdom is that the state cannot discriminate on various grounds. So, can we let any private party or an individual or a group of individuals to promote any form of discrimination? Absolutely not. Then, should we incite violence? Absolutely not. So, whenever there is speech which creates any form of hatred, it can breed all of these things which affects the normal pursuance of a society. Then this rumor mongering today becomes extremely detrimental to internal security. Why? Because today we are hyper connected through social media. And we can say that whenever, let's say, I am writing an article, the reach of the article may not be very high. But if I go for rumor mongering on social media, it can directly connect to billions of people in a very short span of time. And have we seen riots being done through wrongful use of social media? Have we seen various protests happening due to some social media post? Yes. So, speech, whether it is on social media, whether it is in written form, whether it is oral, verbal, in whatever form, we must also look at the platform and the reach. And that also determines the intensity of your punishment. Finally, whenever we are talking about hate speech, somewhere down the line, it also gets connected to larger issues of terrorism, ethnic violence, rioting, etc. So these are internal security issues, and therefore hate speech must be curbed in all forms. Now, it has not been defined, yet we use a bundle of laws to go for prosecution once someone goes for a hate speech or a hateful speech. So section 153A of IPC and section 295A of IPC is usually used in cases of hate crimes. Now 153A talks about promoting enmity, and 295A talks about hurting religious sentiments. And more importantly, if one is found guilty under these sections, then what happens? Your disqualification under Representation of People's Act 1951 triggers under section 8. Furthermore, the section 7 of Protection of Civil Liberties Act, it penalizes incitement to or encouragement of any forms of untouchability. So all the social evils, let's say we have 5 social evils, and through any speech I am promoting such hateful content, whether through writing, whether through internet, through social media. So the hate speech will be triggered. And usually these two sections are applied on any hate speech crime. Now let's look at some case laws to get a better understanding. So this is a case of 2014. So Pravasi Bhalai Sangathan versus Union of India. So here it was prayed that the state should take preemptory action against makers of such speech. But the court said that it will not go beyond the purview of existing laws to penalize hate speech, as it would be judicial overreach. So the court asked to go for the same sections under IPC. Why? Because it was prayed that there is lack of definition, there is lack of objectivity. And because there is lack of objectivity, there comes subjectivity. Subjectivity with the executive. To say so, the police in general. Then it referred the matter to Law Commission to examine. Then in Amish Devgan versus Union of India, Amish Devgan had to tender an apology. Why? Because he was an anchor in a news channel. Then in Vinod Dua versus Union of India, the application of hate speech provisions were nullified by the court because the commentator was giving the opinions. Then very recently, and this is a landmark judgment, so Shaheen Abdullah versus Union of India, here what court said. So the authority must register an FIR. And nobody will come to you to complain for a hate speech, but you can take suo motu cognizance. What do we mean by suo motu? That means I can observe, let's say, social media as executive, and I can just go for a FIR filing. And if the executive is found not to be registering FIR, then it will be treated as contempt of court. Why such stringent statements by the Supreme Court? Because we have seen a spate of such hate speech turning into violence and riots, which has affected the life of people as well as the property of people. Right? Now, let's understand what is the way forward. So, Law Commission has time and again So Supreme Court referred the matter to Law Commission. So Law Commission said it has proposed that separate offense of hate speech should be created under IPC, which criminalizes hate speech. So let's take an example. Let's say 124A is for sedition, but we do not find a section like this for hate speech. So Law Commission is saying that hate speech must also have its own section. Then the Base Barua Committee and Vishwanathan Committee called for the same. And recently what is happening, that a bill is before the Parliament regarding reforms in the criminal laws, the IPC, CRPC, and here there will be a separate section on hate speech. Right? So that is the way forward. Going for clear definition with objective criteria and incorporating the wisdom from the Supreme Court judgments. And many other issues are directly connected to the issue. For example, the Tehseen Poonawalla case, this was a successor to hate speech. Why? Because it looks into issues of mob lynching. So we must appreciate that while we were discussing free speech, then we were discussing hate speech, then it can lead to any hate crime. It can also lead to mob lynching. And therefore, these complex issues which can affect the peace and tranquility of the society needs an objective definition and objective criteria for state action against the perpetrators. Let's now look at the second article. So the second article is pertaining to your GS3, and here RBI has launched a new pilot project for frictionless credit. Now, how it can help us? So India wishes to become a $5 trillion economy, right? And eventually become the third largest economy. Then to move towards $10 trillion economy, right? Now, how will this growth happen? So it will require some investments, and it will also require some consumption. Now, being capital starved, we require a lot of credit. We require a credit pump. And if this credit through technology can be eased, then what will happen? This growth will be more buoyant and it will be more rapid. Now, let's understand what RBI has been doing. So, RBI has launched a public technology platform for frictionless credit. Now, what is this? So, it has been created by RBI Innovation Hub. It's wholly owned subsidiary, and it is based upon end-to-end digital platform and open architecture, and it will be an open API, basically an open software based app will be created, and this will connect all the banks, all the financial institutions which lend, and this will be based on a plug and play model. Now it is in the pilot project. Now let's understand what is frictionless credit. So whenever we are going for the traditional credit system, what happens? We usually go to the bank and then file an application. Let's say I want to get a home loan. So I will give an application. They will ask my salary details. They will look at my PAN details. They will look at my CIBIL score, etc., etc. And on the basis of multiple criteria, which they are pulling from different institutions, right? For PAN, they are looking at income tax department. For salary slip, maybe I have to produce. Then they will also look at my ITRs, right? Income tax returns, CIBIL score. So all those things will be used to finally take a decision of to give a loan or to not give a loan, and what should be the quantum of loan. So they will judge my credit worthiness, that whether or not the financial institutions should do business with me, should they lend to me or not. So that is the traditional approach. Now here, what else happens is that there are a lot of subjectivity. Why? Because there is human interface. And there are also chances of you scratch my back, I scratch your back. So let's say I'm very good friends with a manager. So maybe I can get a better loan, right? Or I can get the loan easily. But if I'm an ordinary citizen who does not have any collateral to offer, I do not have a mortgaged property to offer, then what happens? Then usually I'm denied. Let's say I do not file the ITR, or let's say I do not have a definite salary. I am someone who is a street hawker. So what happens? So usually credit is denied to the needy. However, we see that corporations tend to get their credit. Now, this is to massify credit, to take it to the next level. So what do we mean by frictionless credit? In frictionless credit, let's say a bank is there and I request the bank, or I request a host of banks for a loan of, let's say, 20,000 rupees. Okay. And how do I request? Through, let's say, an app. Now, the bank looks at host of data, and this data is pooled. So there is pooling of data from all these sources. And based upon this data, the bank makes the objective criteria to grant me or to not grant a loan, right? So here what happens? So end-to-end digitization is happening. Then human interface is decreasing. Then the subjectivity is reduced. Why? Because the decision making is based upon data. So data backed decision making. So will it be easier? Will it be easier? Yes. So it will be less time consuming. So whether I'm getting a credit or not getting a credit, I'll get to know it early. So it saves a lot of time. Then many times what happens, due to layers, even if I am credit worthy, due to pooling, or I have to requisition the data from multiple parties. Let's say I'm asking the RBI about something, the income tax department about something, and the employer statement, pay slips, etc. So many documents which I have to produce. So if there are delays, then what happens? There is lag in credit. And if there is lag in credit, then what happens? This incentivizes us to go for or approach the banks for loans. Then data. In this case, what will happen? All the data from, let's say, state government, central government, Aadhaar, your eKYC, all these multiple layers, or RBI. So all my data will be pooled with the RBI, and this data will be offered to the financial institutions so that they can make this objective decision of granting me a loan or not. Now, in the pilot project, the idea is to go for loans in terms of KCC, Kisan Credit Card, and also to MSME, which will be collateral free. Then looking at home loans as well as personal loans. So on a pilot basis, and this has been launched in MP on a pilot basis. And over the period of time, what will happen? It will be launched for all India basis, right? So what will happen? What will be the end product? So the end product will be regarding that loan or credit process will be digitized. So massification, the way we went for Aadhaar stacks, the way we went for JAM Trinity. So smaller reforms pertaining to data. Here what we are doing, we are pooling the data. And this is also a very good example of data integration and data interoperability. So that's a very good move from the RBI to improve credit and make it frictionless. In the third article, we'll be looking at Crumbling Shimla, and this pertains to your GS3 environment and its conservation. Now, what is the context? So the context is simply unsustainable development. That means somewhere down the line, the ecology has been marginalized vis-a-vis the developmental activities and the way we have changed the landscape of Himalayas. Now, we must appreciate at this point what is carrying capacity. Let's say I can provide, or a particular area can provide you with 1,000 liters of water, right? And let's say all of us, each individual consumes 1 liter water. But let's say I bring 1 lakh people here. So what will happen? So the natural carrying capacity of what? To provide water has been breached. So similarly, nature has a limit. It has an upper limit beyond which it is not able to tolerate the human action. And naturally, whenever we as individuals breach this level of carrying capacity, what happens? Some form of hazards will happen. Some form of disruption will happen whenever we are breaching the carrying capacity of any region. So it can be about the water, it can be about the demographic capacity, it can be about construction. So whenever we breach the carrying capacity of any region, what happens? We tend to make ourselves more vulnerable to vagaries of nature and forces of nature. Now let's understand how unsustainability has creeped in. So waterways. So let's say this is a river. Now this river looks like this during summers. Why? Because there is no rainfall. It is dry and parched times. But what happens is that during the monsoon phase, some rivulets will come. Some springs will be coming all the way. And they all will be joining the mother river, the main river. Now, as humans, what we have done is that we saw that these regions were dry during summers. So what we did? We created resorts along the waterways. We created a lot of houses using RCC concrete, right? Have you done it in Himalayas? Yes. Then we went for construction. What kind of construction are we talking about? So we have blocked a lot of waterways. Now, the moment I construct something in the waterway, what happens? This was my waterway and here I have constructed buildings. Now, let's say there is some intense monsoon this year. Then what will happen? This waterway will also increase in size. So what will happen? It will inundate the entire area. And if the construction is not based upon scientific criteria, or if the soil is soft soil, or let's say the rock is sedimentary, or let's say we are living in a seismic zone, or let's say we are living in a landslide prone zone. So what will happen? These waterways will become the biggest source of destruction, right? Then whenever we are talking about construction, what do we mean? So we require a lot of roads, highways, tunnels, resorts. Now, if we are going for scientific planning, then what we'll do? We'll go for a master plan. And we will delineate what activities to be done in what areas. Let's say there is a green area, so we'll avoid the green area. Let's say there is a blue area, so we'll avoid the blue area. But let's say there are some grasslands, so here we can go for some construction. So it has to be based upon scientific criteria and incorporating ideas of environmental impact assessment. Now, let's say I am going for a 4-lane highway, and that too I need it before a deadline. So I need speed. So what I'll do? I will rename a state highway to a national highway and the national highway to a 4-lane highway. And along the existing state highway or national highway, instead of this size of the road, I'll go for doubling of the roads. Now what happens in mountains? Let's say the old orientation of the roads was this much. So this was the size of the road, the width of the road. Now I want to double the road. So what I'll do? I will vertically cut and make double the road. I will double the road. Now what happens? This complete area becomes vulnerable. Why? Because we are going for vertical cutting of mountains. Why? Because we want projects to be delivered in due time. Now, what ought to be done? So, you should go for terracing. Why? Because let's say this was the slope. Now, instead of this, if I go for terracing, then it stabilizes the slope and it decreases the impact of any landslide, mudslide. Why? Because at every juncture, I am trying to hedge it. Hedge any flow that is coming, any debris that is coming, right? But this requires more time and more investments. Then talking about urbanization. So let's say adopting the Delhi model or the Bengaluru model of construction in, let's say, Himalayas. So we are going against what? The community wisdom, the historical wisdom. Why? And why are we going for such hyper urbanization? Because of population pressures. And how do these population pressures or demographic pressures come to Shimla or the Himalayas? So usually due to tourism. So mass tourism. And you can give the example of April-May Shimla. The roads are choked and the 4-lane, so Kalka, Shimla, 4-lane. Then water crisis. Why? Because we are having such high demographic load. So during summers, you are facing water crisis. Shimla also had a 0 water day. Tap ran dry. But during monsoons, what are we seeing? We are seeing a lot of landslides. We are seeing a lot of incessant rainfalls. Now, why it is happening? So one of the primary reasons is climate change. And IPCC AR6 tells that 2 areas of India will be extremely vulnerable to climate change. One is the Himalayas and the second is the coastal regions. Now, what have we witnessed during this spate of disaster hazards that are happening in Himachal Pradesh and in Shimla? So we saw that the southwest monsoon has merged with the western disturbance. So extreme amount of rainfall in the Himalayan foothills. Then simultaneously we looked at cloudburst leading to landslide, leading to flash floods and triggering one hazard, then another hazard. So creating a chain or creating cascading disasters. So whenever we have cloudbursts leading to landslides and flash flood, what will happen to all the unsustainable construction that we have done? So they will be erased and therefore large scale destruction. Now, what is the way forward? So adoption of climate resilience, not only in construction, but also in lifestyle. So going for less carbon or zero carbon lifestyles. So going towards more eco-sensitive model of development and appreciating the ideas of carrying capacity of nature to always develop within the limits set by nature itself. Then going for maybe costly methods but more sustainable methods of construction using terracing. Then going for value tourism. What do you mean by value tourism? So if I'm talking about volume, then I'm basically talking about the footfall. So we have to appreciate that rather than volume, value is important. When we talk of volume, then what happens? It becomes unsustainable. So we have to somehow cap tourism and also cap it during seasons, during peak seasons. Why? Because it creates unsustainable load in all Himalayan regions. Then EIA, SIA must be part. Environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment must be a part of master plans. And without a master plan, such unsustainable development or unplanned development should not be permitted, given that we have seen more than thousands of crores of infra, life, property being lost not only in Shimla but all along the Himalayas, more particularly in Himachal Pradesh. Now let's look at inflation. So let's appreciate the context. So the retail or consumer price inflation had touched 15-month high of 7.44. Now why this rings some red alarms is because whenever we are talking about inflation, and if inflation is within the margin of 4 to 6%, according to the limits set by MPC, Monetary Policy Committee of RBI, so there tends to be no increase in repo rate. And now the world is looking at inflationary pressures and they are continuously increasing the repo rate. And the moment our inflation, our CPI, and more particularly the food basket of CPI, which approximately has 50% of weightage in CPI. So when that is breaching 11%, so what it tells us that in the future, there might be chances of repo rate increase. Now, what happens if repo rate increases? The cost of credit, it becomes high. So naturally, it affects the entire business cycle. Now, we have seen that the NSO data is showing us that cereals, pulses, spices, milk, they are all way beyond the 6% mark. And this has happened more so in July. Now, we also saw that tomato was crossing 200 rupees. So let's now understand why these things are happening. So primary reason is supply side shocks. One is the erratic rainfall and hailstorms. Whenever we are talking about erratic rainfalls, it affects what? It affects the produce or the harvest. Why? Because there is lot of losses. Then it also disrupts the supply chain. Why? Because monsoon triggering landslide, then trucks are not able to pass. So supply chain disruptions naturally due to erratic monsoon. We just saw Himachal Pradesh. Then we are looking at El Nino after a triple dip La Nina. That means for last 4 years, we saw 3 La Ninas, means excessive rainfall. And now after these triple dip La Nina, we are looking at El Nino. That means low rains. And in recent times, we are looking at the driest August possible. Then it will also impact the Rabi harvest. And Rabi onions, they account for 65% of the total harvest. So in total, what are we seeing? That there is supply chain disruption, there is erratic monsoon, there is El Nino, as well as there is global issues. Global issues like post-COVID recovery, Russia-Ukraine war, which has completely disrupted the supply chains and has created more trade barriers. Then whenever we are talking about any perishable commodity, we must also remember that the cold supply chain and the logistics sector play an important role. Why? The idea is that if we want to keep inflation in check, we must have some buffer and we can add some value and increase the shelf life. So whenever we lack the cold supply chain or there are disruptions in the logistics, what happens? The cost of the produce becomes costly. So naturally there is supply chain shocks and then there are issues of storage because we are not able to increase the shelf life. Why? Because onions get rotted if they are stored with high moisture. So they have to be dried first. So that requires some investment in cold supply chain as well as logistics. Now, what is the government step? So export curves. And these export curves, mind you, are now seen as a continuity of what happened with wheat, non-basmati rice. Then dals. Why? So all kind of tur dals, etc. So stock limits have been imposed and restrictions on exports, as well as increase in the export duty. Why? Because it was seen that a lot of these produce was exported while artificial scarcity was created in the domestic economy. Then imposition of stock limits. So this is a source of artificial scarcity. Why? Because we hoard. So hoarding of, let's say, onions. Then what about increasing supply? So 3 lakh ton of buffer onion will be kept with FCI. Then NCCF and NAFED will now start distributing onions for 25 rupees per kg from today. And most importantly, whenever we are looking at any inflation, food inflation, and that too in perishables, we must remember Operation Greens. So Operation Greens looks at TOM. So TOP, tomato, onion, potato. And it has two strategies, long-term strategy and short-term strategy. So whenever we are looking at long-term strategy, it talks about value chain development. That means the moment I give my produce to when it reaches my final consumer, I must go for value addition, shelf life improvement, turning my produced into different varieties, right? The last article pertains to the pardoning powers. Now the pardoning powers comes under the president under Article 72. And these pardoning powers are also available with the governor. However, the pardoning powers of the president are on a higher pedestal. Now, let's look at the various types of pardoning powers and why this is important, because they can directly come in your match the following, or they can directly come in your MCQs. So we must know the definition and understand what each keyword means. So when I'm talking about pardon, so we are essentially talking about removing of sentence and conviction. That means you are not convicted, you are free of your conviction and you are also free of your sentence. Let's say you got 7 years and you were found guilty. So if I am giving pardon, if the president is giving pardon, then both of them is nullified, right? Now, when we are talking about commutation, so we are going for substitution. So let's say turning from rigorous imprisonment of 7 years to normal imprisonment or simple imprisonment of 7 years. Then remission. So here the type or the form is same. That simply means that let's say you have gone for rigorous imprisonment. So now what I'll do is I will turn from 7 years to 4 years. So RI will be same, rigorous imprisonment will be same. In remission, I am just reducing the period. Then respite. So awarding a lesser sentence. Why? Because of some special fact. Example, let's say there is a pregnant lady. So some easier terms of sentencing. Then reprieve. Here I am giving you a stay on the execution. So you are still convicted and the period is also same, but I am giving you a stay. Why? So that you can go for appeal or you can go for mercy petitions before the Supreme Court. Mercy petition, before the president. Why? This is to give you some breathing space. Now, the pardoning powers are usually also in the news. Why? Because there are delays in grant of pardon. And mind you, any pardon is given by the president. But the president does not act alone and works with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. And landmark judgment of Shatrughan Chauhan versus Union of India. the court held that undue delay in terms of decision on pardon becomes a good ground for commutation of sentence. Right? Thank you so much. I hope it helped.